I am Mohammad Shakir, and I am extremely delighted to bring forth this calendar year's first installment of the much anticipated Dean's Speaker Series. To set the context, the series, led by Dean Srivastava, is aimed at delving deeper into finer aspects of leadership across economic and business sectors, being delivered by academicians and business leaders from across the spectrum. The past speakers, in which include celebrated and highly regarded names like Mr. Narayan Murthy, Mr. Krish Gopal Krishnan, Professor David Reeveston, and Professor Shoji Shiba, to name a few. At the heart of it lies the steadfast resolve of the school to evolve continuously and efficiently to a premier B school of the world with an Asia-centric model at its core. From impactful management practices to effective policy making to nuances of sustained economic growth, the series has engaged in a plethora of themes over the years since its inception in 2016 and promises to do the same in the coming years. The India growth story is the one that evokes awe and inspiration in us all, and certainly across the globe. As our nation transitions towards the upper echelons of the world economic order, it is imperative for us to understand the roles played by different factors that have been contributing to this growth, the underlying mechanics of this mind-boggling journey. And what better way to commence proceedings of this calendar year than a discussion on the role of private sector in materializing this dream of a developed India. As our guest this evening, we are extremely privileged to have with us renowned industrialist and philanthropist Dr. Baba Kalyani, Chairman and MD of Bharat Forge Limited, the flagship company of the Kalyani Group and the second largest forgings manufacturer in the world. I request Dean Srivastava to come on the stage and introduce our guest for the evening.
Good evening and welcome to the ISB Dean Speaker Series. Sorry, I've got a little frog in my throat, so may sound a little bit funny, but with immense pleasure, I welcome you all to the Dean Speaker Series. We have a very high hurdle that has been set. For people to be invited to this, they have to achieve at least two things. One is absolutely essential, thought leadership. And the second is impact, either in the government sector or in the industrial sector. And it's really difficult sometimes to have to do both of them. Our speaker today is Baba Saheb Nilkant Kalyani, and he's a third generation entrepreneur. And as you know, he's the CEO and chairman of the Kalyani Group. And if we take what he's been able to achieve, what the company has been able to achieve, it's incredible. It's the first MNC, if you will, in the automotive sector coming from India, and they hold the number 2 position globally. And it has not been easy to do that. I remember doing some work with a company, a collaboration about 10 years ago called Nokia Siemens. It was a joint partnership between Nokia and Siemens, looking at the telecom infrastructure sector. And Siemens at that time had been involved in trying to manufacture things out of India. And it was a Siemens product, but when it said made in India, they were having trouble distributing it. And so I know it's an uphill battle. There's something else called the Edelman Trust Barometer, in which the Asian countries lag behind. And you have the Nordic countries, Finland and Sweden, etc., right at the top, along with Canada. And so what it becomes is a really uphill task for to climb to the top when it comes to the manufacturing manufacturing domain. I was listening to Mr. Kalyani earlier this afternoon, and he mentioned that his company was able to take a crankshaft which lasted about 100,000 kilometers to 2 million kilometers. So it's used to break down, every year. And now you're looking at crankshafts that last more than the life of the truck itself. So going up the ladder is not easy. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of skill to be able to get that kind of quality into your products. And obviously, under his leadership, the company has done very well. Every manufacturer, global manufacturer is on the Bharat Forge, customer list. Includes brands like Mercedes-Benz, Audi, Porsche, you name it, and they are the corporate customers. If we look at what is going on today, is that the Kalyani Group is indigenously manufacturing several defense weapons as well, so it's not just the automotive sector, and including the 155 millimeter 52 caliber advanced Stout artillery gun system, ATAGS as it's called, jointly designed and developed by Bharat Forge along with DRDO, which is a Defense Research and Development Organization. Most recently, as of today, Mr. Kalyani has joined the Prime Minister's Science, Technology and Innovation Advisory Council. He's a principal scientific advisor to GI. He's the only industry leader, in that. So, and he is a Padma Bhushan. He is he's not a stranger to ISP. A decade ago, in this very hall, we held the Strategic Management Society in a conference, and he was there for it, supporting us. And today's talk is focused on the role of the private sector in catapulting India to double-digit growth and trajectory. But before I invite him on board, I would also like to acknowledge just earlier today, this seems to be a day of happenings. Earlier today, he has committed to a scholarship for 5 years, 10 lakhs per year, but he has stipulated it is for women only. So we're very, very grateful to him for that, and please warmly welcome Baba Kalyani.
iPad would have.
Yes, so I please connect करो थोड़ी
Where?
फक्त सिंगल क्लिक केलं की नेक्स्ट स्लाइड
Well, Dean Srivastav, faculty of ISB, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here this evening to share my thoughts on the subject that's mentioned, increasing the role of the private sector in catapulting India to a double-digit growth. At the outset, let me thank Dr. Sanjay Singh for convincing me to be here after almost 10 years that I was here last. It was 2008, the year when the financial crisis happened in the world economy, that I happened to be in this institute giving a talk. A lot of things have changed since 2008. A lot of things have changed in India, a lot of things have changed in ISB since 2008. If you look back in terms of what the country has achieved, it's not insignificant. We now have an economy that's close to $2.2 to $2.5 trillion. depending on whose numbers you take. An economy that's growing at 7 to 7.5% a year, and a whole plethora of new ecosystems that are being developed by our dynamic Prime Minister in creating a huge level playing field for everybody in this country. And the whole idea behind that is how do you propel India to a double-digit growth so that in the next 15, 20 years, we can be counted amongst one of those nations like you see in China today. I have some slides that I have prepared for you, so I will take you through those slides. Unfortunately, I had a very unscheduled surgery on Friday, and I was in the hospital for 2 days. So I'm not in the best of my appearance and health, but please endure me for this little mishap. Now, if you look at India today as we see it, how do we see this country? It's considered as the world's fastest growing economy, a largely consumption-led large economy. From a purchasing power parity is the third largest economy on this planet. At current GDP is now the sixth largest, and very soon probably we will become the fifth largest. And what are the issues that we have in this very large economy of ours? We have a large economy with a lot of poor people. We have a large economy where most of our consumption is based on imports. We have a large economy that exports very little. If you look at the percentage, share of India's exports, including services, is less than 2% of the world trade. And if you look at India's growth in the past, let's say 2002 to 2014, that decade, before the current government came into power, this growth has been largely in parts, not a very holistic growth. The services sector has contributed to a large extent of our growth. Manufacturing and agriculture has been, which absorbs almost 75% of our population, has been growing very marginally. If you look at manufacturing, matter of fact, it has reduced as a percentage of GDP from a high of close to 18% now to somewhere in the mid-15s. And therefore, the theme of my talk is, how do you get this growth back on track, and how private sector can become a major player in getting this growth back on track. Indian economy, at least in the last year or so, in the last few quarters, seems to have regained its momentum in terms of growth. If you look at the trajectory of growth, we have now entered a 7+% growth rate. If you looked at the last 2-3 years, with the disruptions that we have had in the demonetization, in enacting the new GST regime, and all the other changes that have taken place in the regulatory environment, it was a difficult period. But we now seem to have entered a growth phase one more time. And a lot of this growth is happening because of the fundamental changes that the government has made in terms of its policy making, whether it's the Make in India program, whether it's the startup program, whether it's a skilling program, or whether it's the Swachh Bharat scheme. I mean, Swachh Bharat for many of you might just feel like it's cleaning up streets, but it's emerging to be a very big business because you are able to clean what was not cleaned by the municipal corporations or the city governments by private sector at half the cost. So many of these things are driving the Indian economy forward. One of the most significant drivers has been the building up of infrastructure. From 3.6 kilometers a day, we are now building at close to 24, 25 or 26 kilometers a day. And this has created a huge opportunity for the automotive sector, for construction equipment, for trucks, and a large part of the growth in the economy. The Prime Minister has often talked about his vision for the economy. He's talked about defense and aerospace, how India today still imports 75% of its requirements, and how we need to reverse this to making 75% ourselves. He's talked about energy security in oil and gas. We have had a constant oil and gas output in spite of the billions of dollars that we have invested in it for the last 20 odd years at something like 35 million tons equivalent. If you look at electronics, which has now become almost every man's consumption item, whether it's a phone, whether it's a television, whether it's other appliances, 90% of this is imports. And if you talk about agriculture, which is one of the biggest problem sectors in India, and I will talk a little more in details about this sector in my talk, there is a huge amount of angst in the rural sector in India, largely coming out of stagnant incomes in our agriculture sector over the last 15 odd years. If you look at a 15-year period and you look at organized employment in cities, in government, in the private sector, in factories, the average salary levels in organized employments has gone up to something like, at least in Pune, 300 to 500,000 rupees per year for an average person working on the shop floor. In the agriculture sector, the average earning is 25,000 rupees a year for a family. Of course, largely because of fractional ownership, nuclear families breaking up, ownerships breaking up. I mean, there are lots of reasons why this is happening. But it's a problem that needs to be addressed. One good example of what entrepreneurs or innovation can do in this sector. There's a lot of technology in agriculture available, right from precision farming to high yield crops, to using less water, to using less chemicals. A lot of technologies like using UAVs to monitor crop diseases, moisture content. I mean, so many things are available at our fingertips. And today, in spite of that, we give in every state after state farmers free power to draw water from their wells to irrigate their lands. If you look at the cost of that on India's economy, it's humongous, it's huge. Why hasn't anybody thought of creating an industry that creates a solar pump and provides pumping of water using solar energy. I mean, this is just one example of how a problem can become an opportunity. And for this to happen, India clearly needs to move to an innovation-led economy. And what is stopping India from an innovation-led economy? And my reasoning, this is my 48th year in my working life. I have seen from 1971 through the control Raj, license Raj, 21% interest rates, to a liberalized economy in 1991, to a global economy that we see today. I have seen this all. And my understanding is a large part of the problem in India is, by default, we have the public sector. You take any industry, you take machine tools. The government bought in something called Hindustan Machine Tools in the 60s. Look at the machine tool industry today. It's completely destroyed, incapable. Why is the automotive component industry doing so well? There is no public sector in this industry. You take the pharma industry, there's something called Hindustan Antibiotics in Pune. And that time, private companies were not even allowed to be in the pharma business. Look at what the private sector has done in the pharma business. Forget IT, I think nobody understood what IT was. So it kind of prospered. Defense. What is the problem with our defense business? It's the same problem. Default is the public sector. Allow competition, allow private sector to get into it, the whole life will change. And this is what I would like to talk about, that to steer our economy to a double-digit growth, what do you need to do? Of course, the government has a role to play. It's not that the government doesn't have a role to play. It's not that all public sectors are doing bad. But I think you need competition. You need competition to create innovation. You need competition to create a level playing field. You need competition to create products that are made for the markets as the markets want them. Sorry. Our Prime Minister has set objectives for India. The objective is that our GDP will touch somewhere between 2025 to 2027 close to $5 trillion. And the manufacturing sector must contribute 25% of that GDP. Now, if you're looking at that number, it is $1.25 trillion. Today, the manufacturing sector contributes roughly about $380 billion in our GDP. So what we have been able to do in the last, let's say 60 odd years, if you take the first 10 years out of after independence, we need to do 4 times that in the next 10 years. That means the velocity of growth in this sector has to be extremely high. Now, how do we achieve this velocity? And not only just the velocity, we need to achieve it in an era where technological changes, innovation, the whole internet, the explosion of information, the explosion of new technologies like IoT, Industry 4.0, in Japan they call it Society 5.0. All these things are going to impact us, whether we like it or not. And these things have an impact on global geopolitics. You can already see what's happening in America with President Trump. The policies to protect American industry is not born out of competition. It's born out of fear that those jobs are going away. If you look at where India is today, I have taken this graph from a source. It's not my own chart, so you have to excuse me for that. But we are today an economy that largely works, as we call it, factor-driven economies. Low wages, low output, low productivity, less innovation. And if you look at where we want to be in 2030, we want to be an innovation-driven economy. And the difference between the two is India will continue to grow. It's not that India will not grow. It will continue to grow at 7.5%, 8%. But by 2030, if we don't move from a factor-driven economy to an innovation-driven economy, you will be a large country with a large GDP, but with a lot of poor people. If you transform yourself to an innovation-driven economy, like many of our neighbors have transformed, China is a good example. China has done its transformation in 30-odd years. Before that was Korea. Before that was Japan. There are many, many examples of how economies have transformed themselves in less than 3 decades. If we transform ourselves, we'll be a rich nation with a large number of medium-income people, which is what India strives to be. And therefore, the role of private sector becomes extremely important in creating innovation, entrepreneurship, and whatever have you, to solve the challenges and problems that we have in front of us. And these challenges are not what we see today. You're going to have many more challenges based on the volatility of technology, the volatility of geopolitics, the protectionist attitudes that are running around the globe, and our own internal problems. And I'll give you one good example of what our internal problems are. I talked about rural incomes, agricultural incomes, which have stagnated for the last almost decade and a half. Now, the Prime Minister has put a program to double agricultural incomes in the next 2 to 3 years. It's a very good program. But what this has done is created so much of anger in a large population living in India that is now coming out in the form of the Maratha Andolan that you see in Maharashtra. I mean, this is not about caste, this is not about religion, this is not about anything else. This is simply about saying that I have been educated, I need a job, help me find a job. And if you have 60-70% of your population moving in that direction, this country really doesn't have a future. And that's something that we need to really think about. And therefore, creating an economic growth which is 10% plus is almost imperative for this country to create those jobs that we need to create. And these are not jobs that will be created only in factories. You can create jobs in agriculture, you can create jobs in distribution, you can create jobs in supply chain, you can create jobs in cold storage. I mean, there are any number of opportunities. And why is it not happening? It is not happening because the default line is the state sector. I will end my argument here, and maybe I can answer a lot of questions during the question answer period. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to start off with the first question, but after that it's cold calling. And so you've sort of mentioned that big drawback has been the public sector, and you also focused on moving from factor to efficiency to innovation. So whenever there's innovation, I've found whether it was computers 50, 60 years ago, or you've seen other innovations come along, there generally is a resistance to innovation. And what do you think are the key factors that are holding innovations back? I mean, we see a lot of ideas start, but they don't catch enough traction.
First of all, I think till about 2-3 years ago, we really didn't have an ecosystem that created a level playing field for innovative ideas. And I think that's a breath of fresh air that this new government has been able to put in our system. And therefore, you're beginning to see a lot of young Indians beginning to take risks in creating startups, and many of them being successful. So this is one. Second, I don't think we as a nation or we as a people are fearful of innovation. If you look at the simple use of mobile phones, and if you look at how many people are using payment services through mobile phones today, it's unbelievable that even the most uneducated have learned how to use this. And this is, I think, one of the biggest innovations in the fintech business that's beginning to happen. And it's just the tip of the iceberg. I think this is a huge opportunity for young people, the whole fintech area. It's all going to get far more innovative than it is today.
So basically what you're saying is the population is innovative, is open to adoption of innovations, yet there's something holding it back. Earlier in the day you had mentioned that there are issues with Make in India, and that you tell me what's wrong with it. Could you make a comment on Make in India?
You see, if you look at Make in India today, there are 3 buckets for Make in India. First bucket is what we are already good at. The automotive industry, the component industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the whole range of industries where India is good at and is doing wonderfully well globally, exporting, innovating, and taking over global market shares in a big way. There's another set of industry where the government back in the 60s and the 70s, for whatever good or bad reasons, decided that this must be only in the public sector. So that's defense, big industry, electronics, another industry, steel. Steel till 1991 was banned for the private sector, till 1991. Okay, it was only in the public sector. Many of these industries, oil and gas, public sector till recently. Now what has happened to these industries? Why do we keep importing 75% of our defense requirements? We were making better fighter planes in the 60s and 70s than we make today. And I mean, many of you may not know, but Hindustan Aeronautics was a private sector company at one time, started by Seth Lalchand Hirachand from Mumbai to service US World War II aircrafts, which were in the eastern region at that time. So there are any number of examples I can give you. Why India cannot make machine tools? We lost the race. Today we are import dependent. Why can't we make any large equipment, whether it's power plant, take solar energy. I mean, we import all the panels from China. Why can't we make our own fighter aircrafts? Why can't we make, sophisticated electronic equipments? We don't even make a phone, a cell phone. Why? Because the phone manufacturing was in ITI, another public sector entity. Why didn't it transform itself as the world was transforming? So it could be a good topic for research at our ISB.
Well, I think we see the answer already out there. It's coming in terms of resistance, from these industries. Let me open it to the floor. Yes, middle. If you could, state your name and ask one question, not three questions.
Sure, sir. Good evening. Mr. Kalyani, we very much appreciate your thoughts and your big role in taking India forward, particularly to take India to double-digit growth. Your suggestion that in the past government has given too much role for the public sector, that is why we couldn't progress in various industry areas, but now the private sector has overtaken all those areas, beating on the public sector. And there is big role for private sector, as you rightly said. Thank you very much for these ideas, sir. I have a question, if you permit. It's not directly growing out of your talk, but relating to India's development and how to grow with double-digit growth going forward. For India to grow, the role of private sector, public sector, industry, development, all these are fine. For this to really achieve the goal, we have other hurdles other than industry related, like caste, community tensions, Mandir Masjid tensions, terrorism, Naxalism, reservation quota, Patel, Jat, this and that, and region to region disparities, political fightings. With all these hurdles, how do you think, while private sector, public sector may work well, but would these tensions not obstruct the real growth plans what you projected? As we have recently seen that Mumbai was brought to grinding halt, Delhi was brought to grinding halt, industries will be closed down for that day, 2 or a week. So this kind of tensions are there. How do you think our country will address these concerns to settle down so that we can go forward to achieve the goals of double-digit? Thank you.
That's a very classic chicken and egg story. If you don't have high enough growth and you don't create enough jobs, these tensions are going to just manifest even much more. That's what I just mentioned regarding what's happening in our state. So it's even more imperative for us to first kickstart the engines of growth. And today, there are unbelievable opportunities in almost any direction you want to see. All you need is a level playing field. You need the ability to compete on a level playing field. It's not that the public sector is bad or the private sector is good. There's nothing to do with that. It's just that you cannot have an inhibitive process where you have an unfair competitive process.
Yes, over to the right.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Sriram Jayasima. You mentioned 3 buckets, but you left out the third. Can you tell us what the third bucket is?
Well, the first bucket was the existing businesses like the automotive business, the automotive ancillary business, the pharma business. I mean, businesses that are largely in the private sector doing extremely well. The second bucket is electronics. You know, we missed the electronic revolution back in the 80s itself, when the electronic revolution started. I won't go into the details, but we had a Department of Electronics in the Government of India. And that Department of Electronics said, we don't need, the IBM CEO was told that we don't need you. You can go back. We can build our own computers. There's an institute in Kalyani. I went to Kalyani bits. It's called CIRI. It's an electronic research institute. Some of my Kalyani friends probably know that. They were given the task to do this, and we completely missed out on the electronic revolution. There is no electronic manufacturing worth its name in India today. Now with Samsung coming in to make cell phones and things like that, that will happen. And the third bucket was to do with the defense sector, where we continue to rely to a very, very large extent on imports.
Yes.
Good evening, sir. My name is Piyush Kar. And my question is, when we talk about the startups and innovation, so most of that is happening in the service sector, so be it e-commerce or the fintech. So how do you see the startup playing a role in the manufacturing sector, and what are the hurdles that the young generation is not venturing into manufacturing?
You know, I think this is one of the big problems that we have in our country, that the talent that is available is so much attracted to industries, or let's say businesses, that are reliant on internet, e-commerce, technology, that nobody wants to do something in businesses that rely on manufacturing. Manufacturing is a pretty hard game. It's not a soft game. It's a pretty hard game. But also, you have any number of stories where people have done extremely well in this sector, whether it's small or medium sector enterprises, whether they are large enterprises, or they are very, very large companies who are in this sector. You know, it's a question as to how you can create demand in this sector by creating a level playing field. And if the demand comes up, for example, a good example is what has happened to the LED light bulb program, the whole Ujala program. I don't know whether you guys are aware of this or not. The government launched this Ujala program to change light bulbs to LEDs. It was a government sponsored program. And LEDs that were costing 700 rupees per bulb on a global basis came down to 70 rupees per bulb. And today India manufactures something like 700 million LED bulbs a year. A whole new industry was born, and it changed the world order for LED bulbs in terms of pricing. This is the power India and Indian market can create. And this is true for many, many. If tomorrow you can come up with a solar pump for agriculture, you would probably send 100 million solar pumps a year in this business.
Before I go to the next question, this is a related question. If we take solar cell phones that you just mentioned, the market in India is huge. And typically, when the market is huge, there's opportunity for at least some amount of vertical integration. So if you take the service companies that are tapping the market, you might think they would invest some in research and development for product development as opposed to research. Why is product development not taking place in some of the larger companies?
If you look at solar, the answer is not so complicated. When the solar program started in India 3 years ago, the government of India decided that they will pay 14 rupees per kilowatt hour for solar power, and it will be subsidized by NTPC charging a little extra money on the coal-based or thermal-based power that they produce and sell. Somebody got a bright idea in the system that why not do a reverse auction on this. And the reverse auction brought that 14 rupee rate down to 2 rupees 20 paisa, 2 rupees 40 paisa. At 2 rupees 40 paisa, the solar business stopped being a technology business. It became a financial arbitrage business. Your ability to get cheap money long term from somewhere and create an arbitrage of 2 or 3%. And therefore, nobody wants to invest into this business except put up solar plants, get a tariff of 202 rupees 40 or a little more for the next 25 years and becomes an annuity business. Now, this is where I think policy making went wrong.
Marketing interference. Yes, the front row.
I am Dr. Chakravarti, a retired IAS officer. I worked both in government of Andhra Pradesh and central government. Dr. Kalyani, you gave an excellent presentation. You stressed rightly two things. One is the economy and activity should be innovation-led, correct? And two, create more jobs. That's also correct. But as we look at things around us, the disruptive technology that is taking place in the world and in India in particular is creating a problem of jobs. For instance, many people say we can reskill people and get things done, but it's not happening that way, not significantly. But when our artificial intelligence or Internet of Things or 3D or whatever, all these things are eliminating jobs. And if there is a manifestation of the problem in terms of, as you correctly said, the education in your state and even earlier in Gujarat and so on and so forth, it's very worrisome to me as to whether we are really going to create jobs or this disruptive technology, which is called creative destruction in Schumpeter's language. It's of course innovation-led, but it creates a problem of jobs and job creation. What exactly would be your response to this?
I think an extremely important question, and you're very right that jobs are getting disrupted with technology, but jobs are also getting created. And I'll give you examples of where jobs are getting disrupted and jobs are getting created. If you look at the traditional jobs, normally in India, traditional jobs was factory shop floors, government service, or let's say healthcare related. These are the traditional jobs. As far as factory shop floors are concerned, jobs are not getting created to an extent that you want it to be created. Now, if you create manufacturing capability for the $90 billion worth of electronics that we import every year, for the $60 billion of defense equipment that we import every year, if you create manufacturing facilities within India, and for another $100 billion of capital goods that we import every year, you will create huge number of jobs. And that's exactly my point, that we need to make these things happen. And these are not happening because today for all these things, the public sector has become the default line, for good or bad reasons. Number two, the new industries that are coming up because of the technology change, whether it's internet, whether it's IoT, whether it's e-commerce, all those things. I just read this morning that the e-commerce companies in India are expecting to make 4.2 million package deliveries a day in the festival season that begins with Dasara and ends with Diwali. Now somebody is making those packages, somebody is making those cardboard boxes, somebody is delivering it somewhere, somebody is sending it by truck to some place. Some logistics businesses are booming. I also read yesterday that the fintech sector is going to triple its jobs in the next 2 years. Whether it's insurance, whether it's financial services, whether it's NBFCs, I'm not talking about banks. I'm talking about the new fintech sector that's coming up. So there are a lot of new jobs coming up. Agriculture sector we haven't even touched because nothing is happening in that sector. If we can just bring in higher technology in the agriculture sector, make the government take 2 steps back and allow some form of corporatization of farming. I'm not saying take over the lands, but allow these things to happen. It will create huge number of jobs in that sector, right from production to storage, to distribution, to processing. So there are plenty of opportunities. There is a program that's going on in Maharashtra where the Middle East and Saudi Arabia want to invest $6 billion in the coastal side of Maharashtra to create agricultural produce to export to them. So any number of opportunities to create jobs.
This question to the left and preferably, from a lady. I guess. All right. We'll go with the left at least.
Sir, my name is Vinay. I come from a small-scale industry, in the manufacturing industry. My question is about the third bucket, that is the defense, and particularly in the area of ammunition. So, whereas the market, that is the end user, is constantly looking at futuristic products and the state of the art. So where is the opportunity for Indian industry to catch up with the state of the art technology, and particularly the big five, yes, they can buy technology from elsewhere, but the small scale sector, how do they contribute? Because there's a lot of infrastructure available, basic skills available. How do we convert this capability into a product, and that too with the state of art, what the end user is looking for? Thank you.
You know, first of all, as far as defense and military is concerned, the services will always look for the best product, the state-of-the-art product. There's no doubt about it. And I don't think you can deny our forces the best available equipment. The problem is, Hyderabad is a good place for defense industries. I think a lot of small and medium sector industries in this city is engaged in the defense sector very successfully. I just saw around our new facility today near the airport, half a dozen plants which are related to defense. But to answer your question, we were developing an artillery gun for the last 4 years. We started in 2014, and just yesterday, the MOD has cleared an order for 150 guns on us. And this was a program we did with DRDO. It was a DRDO industry collaboration, a very successful one, that in 3 years' time you have a product ready like a very modern artillery weapon. Now, this would not have happened in our case if we didn't have an ecosystem of more than 100 sub-suppliers, which are small and medium scale. So the way companies like yourselves get involved in this whole ecosystem, value chain, supplier chain, is by following a process like this. Now, this can happen much easily if large amount of private sector companies get involved in defense, create an ecosystem of nobody can make everything themselves. You have to be dependent on a large supply chain in your system. Now, what is currently happening, you put your standards here, somebody says he can make it, he doesn't make it, and that somebody is largely a defense PSU or Government of India company, and then we end up importing it. I give you any number of examples in this space. And that cannot create an ecosystem. Then an ecosystem that gets created in the supplier range is an ecosystem that will never allow you to make any money, never allow you to make any profits. Half of them go bankrupt after 6 years. And that's the ecosystem that gets created.
Hello, sir. Good evening, sir. Thanks, Kalyani, sir, for giving wonderful presentation. I am Madhav Reddy, working on zero budget politics. Actually, whether you agree or not, most of the politicians, either MLA or MP, they are spending huge amounts of crores of money to get elected. Because of that reason, for example, I am hailing from Anantapur, Rayalaseema area, where the politicians are obstructing every industry. They are not allowing new industries to come to plan. So if we find that kind of politicians ruling by us, what we can expect, industries, growth and everything. Why don't you support the politicians, who are really working for the society? Actually, for last 2 years, I have been going around India, educating the people coming to the politics. There is a way we can win the elections without spending huge amounts. The entry itself wrong, then how we can expect, good results from the politicians? And most of the politicians are backed by businessmen and, nothing but looting the government's money or whatever. All crises are just because of political heads or respective village to country. What you can say is, how you can support, the industry can support the right politicians.
I'm very scared with the comment that you made. But I'm scared not because you talked about politicians. I'm not scared about that. I'm scared because you talked about Anandpur. Okay? Now, for your information, Telangana and Andhra has been ranked at the top in terms of economy-friendly, business-friendly policies. At the top, Telangana number 1, Andhra number 2. Now, if you think of these states like the way you think, imagine what's happening in the other states.
Rima.
My name is Rima. Delighted to have you here and equally delighted to hear about the scholarships. Hope some of it goes towards the doctoral program as well. I think just want to follow up on this gender question. We talk about Indian economy growing. Could you talk a little bit about the labor force participation of women in the workforce? Some of the statistics talk about if all the women who would work, there would be 20% GDP growth in Indian economy. Could you talk about what role do you see of women playing in the growth of Indian economy, as well as what sectors offer a promising charge, and maybe a little bit about women entrepreneurs? Would love to hear your thoughts on them.
First about women in the manufacturing sector. I think it's a fantastic idea. There was a gentleman who was the chairman of Cummins Incorporated, Tim also, a very good friend of mine. Tim was chairman of Cummins in Columbus, Indiana for more than, I think, a decade. He later on became chairman of General Motors when Mary Barra was the CEO. Another great women executive, as you know. He wanted to employ women in his plant in Fulton. Fulton is a small town, more like a village, overgrown village, about 100 kilometers from Pune, with not much infrastructure. But they built a big factory there, and they wanted to employ women. And this was just 5 years ago. Now, that women cannot work in factories after 6 o'clock. Okay? So first that law had to be amended, because you cannot have women working in one shift and then somebody else doing that. It needs to be like a continuous process. That law was changed, and now that plant in Fulton has, I think, 60% of its workforce which is women, and largely women from the rural area. Quite amazing. Of course, they trained them, they did everything else. In cities, it's a little difficult. If you're in Pune, you're in Delhi, you're in Chennai, a little difficult to employ women in the factory because they have too many alternatives. But if I was to set up a plant in a rural place, we are setting up a plant in Nellore right now, in Mr. Naidu's Andhra Pradesh, a manufacturing facility. And one of the things that we have targeted to do is to at least employ 30% of our workforce as women. So I think it's an extremely important and something that will recharge our economy also. Now, women as chief executives, I think we have too many women as chief executives in India. Most of the banks are run by women. A lot of companies today, we have women at the top. So I don't think there is any bar or there is any issue in terms of women becoming chief executives. I think India is a fairly open country with an open thought process as far as that is concerned.
All right. Yeah, go ahead.
Good evening, sir. My name is Bharat. I'm from PGP Course 2019. First of all, thank you for such an insightful presentation. My question is about your presentation only. So we all know that the present government has run a lot of good initiatives like Skill India, Ujala and Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. All are targeted towards that double-digit growth. And a lot of credit goes to our dynamic Prime Minister, Mr. Modi's out-of-box thinking. Now elections are due next year, and we all know that a lot of big and small parties have come together with just one goal, and that is to defeat just one person, Mr. Modi. What do you think that how it is going, if God forbid that those people come in the power, then how it is going to impact that growth story of India?
You know, experience shows that policy in India has not changed with politics. If you look at the major policy changes that happened in 1991 when Prime Minister Narasimha Rao with Manmohan Singh as the finance minister overnight liberalized this country from a lot of rules, regulations, licenses. And that kind of continued even in the next government when coalition came, continued when Mr. Vajpayee became Prime Minister. So good policies in this country has a track record that good policies tend to sustain. And I believe that whatever Prime Minister Modi is doing today to open up the economy, to create growth, to create equal opportunities for a lot of people, to create a level playing field, to globalize the Indian economy, to bring in foreign investments, I don't think you will see changes if the political scenario changes.
I think, all right, if we can make it short, because
Yeah, sure.
we've run over time already.
Yeah, sorry. Good evening, sir. Really, it's a inspiring talk with you and all. My question is a very country for country. Most of my family members, more than 50 members of my family, they are well settled in US, more than 30, 40 years, and all are in top position. EDS, Microsoft, name the company. What I want to do, what I give message to you, how to bring these brilliant people in India. They have seen the corruption here. They don't have facility here. That's why they don't want to come back to India. They are saying that they can bring billions of dollars to India if the government, if people are encouraged, energetic. So how to bring these people? So they are ambassador of India. They are successful people from India to US country and Australia and many other countries. So my question is, what message, what encourage you need you to bring these people? Thank you, sorry.
The whole philosophy of ease of doing business is centered around exactly the point that you make. If it becomes easier for people to come back and have a hassle-free life and create something that they want to create, they would gladly come back. It's a good example. Dean Srivastava here.
Well, I was out for 44 years. I wish I had come back 10 years earlier. My mistake. All right. Thank you. This has been a very, very insightful session. Thank you, Mr. Kalyani. I think what we've learned from you is that innovation-led processes will create jobs. It doesn't matter whether it's in fintech or it's in e-commerce. It looks on surface they're destroying jobs. But as you noted, somebody has to do the packing, somebody has to do the manufacturing, somebody has to do the shipping. So there's plenty to go around with innovation. The role, of course, is to create jobs from the private sector. But interestingly, very clearly, the message is that the business of government should be to get out of business. And I mean, it's being said many times that this is what the government will do, but is not able to do it for multiple reasons. But noted out here during our discussions is that we need a level playing field where an opportunity, where people have opportunity to do well, by doing good. But also, related to one of the last questions that was brought up is that with the ease of doing business as a country, we will do better. Before I came back to India, I used to joke that things are so difficult in India that Indians, once they get out of India, they find it so easy to do work that they rise to the top very, very quickly. That should not be the case. What we need is an environment where people can contribute to the economy, and that means that the government should not be trying to compete with the private sector. And that is a message that has come through very, very clearly. Another thing that is important is that innovation is going to require an ecosystem, whether it's a value chain or a supply chain. So it requires that we all work together, and that larger companies will have a responsibility for nurturing ancillary industries. And so we need to look at what has worked. For example, we see that in the automotive supply business things have worked. Things are beginning to click in healthcare. The process technologies are really clicking. So we need to learn from the industries where things are happening and then carry it over into industries where things should be happening. Lastly, I feel that what we've learned from today is that we ought to be looking forward. We can waste a lot of time by looking backwards. We should look forward in terms of innovation. And so what I also gather is that innovation is not necessarily just technology. It is finding ways in which we can do things better. And although leveraging technology will certainly accelerate the process. Once again, thank you very much for a very insightful discussion. And also, I would like to thank the audience. You guys have been good, coming in the evening. So a good hand to yourselves as well. Thank you.
I would request Dean Srivastava to present a memento to our guest of the evening. Thank you, Dr. Kalyani, for such wonderful thoughts. Thank you, Dean Srivastava, for facilitating and initiating this series and the insights that have been generated through today's discussions. Thank you, everyone who has joined. Hope you had a good time. Until next time, goodbye.